Very much. Welcome everybody to our fourth Safe Sport workshop run by Via Sport here in Vancouver. This one is focusing on complaints handling because that is a burning topic and we seem to have hit a nerve because we have a much bigger registration for this than we normally do. So I'm really excited about this session. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And that, that's the standard blurb, but honestly, I flew back into Vancouver from Europe on Monday, and every time I come back here, whether I'm living here or visiting here, I appreciate the beauty of this place. And I see it very differently than I did even 5 years ago. So I do want to acknowledge that my perspective is changing. And I think land acknowledgements are more than just the words. I think they're about expressing how we're learning and how we're educating ourselves. And it's quite important to me to do that. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And thank you to the people in the chat who are adding what lands they're on. So thank you for that. So today is the 14th of July, 2022, and we are really lucky to have representatives of the Office of the BC Ombudsperson's office with us today. And you may have never heard of them. I stumbled across their resources a few months ago and oh my gosh, it was all the information that I had been looking for all in one place. Sadly, they serve public authorities and not our sector, but they were willing to come and run this session for us. And we're very grateful for that because they do this all day, every day. This is what they do. They handle complaints. And they're really good at it. And their advice is so clear and so practical that I'm really hoping we can all take away some really practical information from this session. So I would like to welcome Erin Gormakin, who has been working for the Office of the BC Ombudsperson since 2019 when she joined and started off as an investigator of individual complaints. And I know how you investigate is a big question for me. So really glad that you have that expertise. And then she joined the Public Authority Consultation and Training team, which is probably why she's here today. So very big welcome to you. I love the fact that you included your sort of past life in your bio, which is that you were a paramedic, a nurse, and a nurse educator. So some other day when we're not on the clock, I would love to hear how you ended up where you are, because there's definitely a story there as well. And Erin is supported by Zoe MacMillan, who is also from the Office of the BC Ombudsperson. Before we get rolling, Erin, I have a couple of housekeeping items. One is, for those of you who haven't done so already, could you please check into the chat with the name of the sports organization or organizations that you're representing on this call? And as I said earlier, this is purely for our curiosity. If you don't want to share that information, that's fine. But by having that information, that will help us see who we've missed and who we need to reach out to in the future. So if you could do that in your own time, that would be lovely. And then we have a poll to run. If Emily can get that one up and running, that would be lovely. I work in Safe Sport. I'm the Safe Sport manager here at Via Sport, but I am also a scientist and a complete data nerd. So of course, I'm going to ask you to rate your perception of knowledge about Safe Sport and complaint handling. So we'll just wait for that to pop up. Is it working okay, Emily? Yay. Okay, it's coming. Yeah. You can come off mute, Emily, and just let me know how's it going.
It's going pretty well. We've got 84 of 100 people on the call have answered.
Oh my goodness, I can't see it. That's what's going on. Oh, okay.
Do you want me to end the poll and share, or do you just want me to end it?
Is it pretty stable number?
Yeah, we're holding. Yeah.
Holding, sure, you can end the poll.
Okay.
It wasn't meant to be a big long thing. I'm just really curious where people are at right now. And of course, I'm going to ask you the same question at the end of the session to see if we move the needle. Okay, so I think I've taken up enough of your time. As we're going along, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if it's an urgent question, then we'll see if we can fit it in right away, if that's okay, Erin. And if it can wait until afterwards, we should have lots of time for questions at the end because we anticipated that there would be quite a few. So over to you, Erin, and thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. Is that looking good for everyone? Wonderful. Okay. So thank you so much for the introduction. As Andrea said, my name is Erin, and I've been with our office here since 2019. My colleague Zoe is on the call as well, and I've asked her to join us today, mostly just to help field some questions at the end, because it's such a wonderful and large turnout. I thought there might be some strength in numbers, and two heads are always better than one. So this afternoon, I'm joining you from our office, which is located on Fort Street in Victoria, and that is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Gormakin peoples, the Esquimalt and the Songhees First Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank them and their ancestors for their stewardship of this land. So the goal of today's session is really to share some best practices in complaint handling. Since, as you know, we're going to get into what our office is and the role of our office, because as Andrea alluded to, sometimes people haven't heard of us. But one of the main functions of our office is receiving and dealing with complaints. And so because of that, we've been able to develop a number of tools and resources related to effective complaint handling that I'm hoping to share with you. And I'm hoping that there'll be some really good takeaways out of today's session. And I'd also just want to make sure that folks know where to find more of the resources that we've developed on our website when we're done, because we do have a shorter time together today, but we have so much stuff available to the public that you can look up as well. So moving right along, we are going to be spending about 30 minutes, hopefully, of me talking at you, and then 30 minutes of hopefully some great questions and discussion afterwards. So to begin, we'll go over very briefly just the role of the Ombudsperson's office, and we'll talk a little bit about administrative fairness, which is sort of what our office is all about. And then we're going to get into some of the essentials of complaint handling, and I'll talk about some handy communication tips that you can use, as well as we're going to touch briefly on some of the things to consider when we're dealing with challenging conduct. And then at that point, we'll get into our question period. So who are we? Why are we here? The Office of the Ombudsperson is an independent office, and our mandate is to provide independent and impartial oversight of public bodies in BC. So as Andrea said, most of your organizations are likely not under our jurisdiction, but there's still a lot of value to be had in sharing information today. So I mentioned that our office is independent, and what that means is that we operate independently from the BC government, independently from political parties, and independently from elected officials. Our ombudsperson, his name is Jay Chalk, and he's appointed by and reports to the legislature, not a specific minister. And when we talk about being impartial, we mean that we aren't advocates for government or for the people who come to us with their complaints. Instead, we're really concerned with identifying issues of unfairness in public administration. And then we consult with public organizations to hopefully try and resolve some of those concerns. So as I alluded to earlier, our office is all about administrative fairness, but what does that actually mean? This may not seem like it's fitting in with the rest of our content necessarily, but I think it's really important to understand the origin of a lot of complaints often comes from situations where decisions are being made, for example, and that's sort of where this administrative fairness piece comes into. Are you administering your organization and your services to the public in a fair way? So we're just going to talk about it briefly on this slide here. And so, yeah, we're all about administrative fairness over here. And that's about making sure that those who are impacted by decisions are being treated fairly. And what treating someone fairly looks like is going to depend on the context of the situation. Fairness is a bit of a flexible concept, and sometimes there might be a higher duty of fairness owed, depending on the nature and impact of the decision that is being made, like, you know, the impact that's going to be had to the person who is subject to that decision. And there's a few key fairness principles that should always be considered. And so we use this fairness triangle that you're seeing on the screen here as a tool to help explain and explore the different principles of administrative fairness. So the first dimension is a fair process, or what is known as, we call it procedural fairness. This side of the triangle is about following a fair process when you're making a decision that impacts a person, a group of people, or an entire organization. And this includes the steps of a decision that a decision maker is taking before, during, and after making the actual decision. It includes things such as ensuring that those making these decisions are impartial and unbiased, that they provide an opportunity for the person or people who are going to be impacted by that decision to be heard, and that clear and meaningful reasons are provided for that decision. So moving on to the next side of the triangle, which is the decision side, we're looking here at, you know, what was decided? Were the relevant rules followed? Was the decision itself reasonable given the circumstances? So this could include things like making sure that the appropriate rules are followed in reaching your decision, that the decision maker considers the individual circumstances of the person when they're making their decisions. So that's touching a little bit on exercising discretion, and that the decision maker has all of the information that they need to make their decision and is basing their decision only on complete and relevant information and not really on any other basis. And then finally, the service piece. So we kind of look at this as the human or relational side of the fairness triangle. And we're really looking at how people are being treated when we're talking about this side. So this is a really important aspect of fairness, particularly because if somebody feels like they weren't fairly treated, even if the other two sides of that triangle have been done correctly and properly, that can often lead to a complaint, just that feeling of having been treated unfairly or feeling like the service was poor, or, you know, substitute any other word in there. And so actually concerns about service fairness are often at the core of the complaints that we receive at our office. So in terms of fair service, this could include things like demonstrating good communication and respectful treatment to the person who's accessing services from your organization, making sure your services are accessible to people and that they're delivered in a timely way. And we also want to be accountable and fix any errors or mistakes that might come up when they occur. So that's a little bit of background about us. And I think that the fairness triangle is just sort of helpful to have in the back of your mind as you're thinking about complaints handling, because those are sort of some of the building blocks that could then turn into a complaint if their pieces are missing. All right, so moving right along, let's get into the actual essentials of complaint handling. So It's best if complaints can be handled and effectively resolved right at the point at which they're received. And this is usually done by frontline employees who are receiving the complaint. We know that frontline employees who work directly with the public are really the face of any organization. And so how they respond to complaints is important, and that can really leave a lasting impression on someone's perception of an organization. And I should have a little disclaimer here that, given how many people are joining us today, I'm sure that there are some organizations where it's like, well, frontline employee, I'm the frontline employee and the whole organization. So, fit this into whatever context that is applicable to you. But generally speaking, the takeaway from that is we want to try and deal with the complaint sort of as it comes in, at the level that it comes in, to the best extent possible. So with all that being said, as we go through this next section, if you aren't in that role, if you're not the person who's receiving those point of service complaints, I'd still invite you to think about the people in your organization who do, and how those employees can be supported to respond more effectively to complaints with the aim of avoiding escalation. So why does good complaint handling matter? It's important to respond well to complaints, and there's lots of reasons why, but I'm going to just start here by asking you to think of a time when you experienced really good complaint handling. So that could have been, you doing a good job at dealing with a complaint that came into your organization, or maybe you were the person complaining about something to somebody else. What made that a good experience? What was it about that interaction that worked really well? How did it help you to reach a resolution in the matter? So maybe you're thinking of a complaint that was dealt with really quickly and it didn't lead to a long and drawn out dispute. With that in mind, we know that complaints, as I said, can be best dealt with when they're responded right at the point at which they're received. And we know this might be easier in larger organizations that have dedicated staff to respond to complaints and concerns, but even smaller groups should provide their members with some mechanism to raise complaints and concerns. And the response that's provided at the point the complaint is received can make all the difference. So we know that good complaint handling matters because when an organization effectively addresses the complaints it receives, ideally at the level of the organization where that complaint was received, there are a number of positive outcomes for both the complainant and for the organization itself. So for example, it can strengthen relationships. So effectively managed complaints can build on and strengthen relationships that you already have with the folks that are accessing your services. Having an effective complaints process can also repair any service delivery weaknesses or gaps that might have been identified and can help to inform and support decision-making regarding future service delivery and program development to ensure that you're sort of participating in a continuous improvement process. Handling complaints appropriately right from the start also is really efficient. It's going to save your organization time and resources. And when an organization responds effectively to complaints at the point that they're received, it helps to prevent escalation and can potentially avoid more challenging and unreasonable conduct down the road. So let's move on now to sort of how do you set the tone for this within your organization? Here are a few steps that you might want to consider. So first, establishing and supporting an organizational culture that values and welcomes complaints as a really good source of feedback from service users. The goals here would be making things right when a complaint is substantiated. So when you find that there really was a basis for this complaint, and then fixing and learning from those mistakes. So it's sort of a growth mindset, and all feedback is good feedback. Another thing that you might want to think about is recruiting staff who are able and willing to handle complaints and who have the appropriate skill set to do so. And you also want to support those staff by providing training and empowering those frontline staff to be able to resolve the complaints early, including being able to provide an apology when appropriate. or immediately correct something like a service issue that's come up. So giving sort of that power to those frontline staff to be able to just make those decisions and do that right away. Establish and make accessible written policies and procedures that outline your complaint resolution process. From what I know, I think that at least Via Sport has some stuff on the website. There may be at the federal level some more things happening in terms of this, but I think that the more transparent that organizations can be so that people know what to expect, the better. So you want to make sure that there's clear information on your website or, you know, other sort of publicly available materials that indicate where people can bring their concerns. So having a contact person for complaints or information about how you handle complaints about your organization. And this is different than having information about how you respond to the complaints. We're just talking about making sure people know, where do I go? I have a complaint, something's come up. How do I even bring this to the attention of the organization?
Can I chip in for a sec, Erin?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so the stuff that we have on our website is from the Office of the BC Ombudsperson because it's so clear, and it includes a template, right? Your complaint handling guide document. The back end of it is a template procedure, and it includes all the kinds of information that would be helpful to include on your web page or wherever for people. It's exceptional, and I will be working with another partner in the sports system at the federal level to try and tweak it to make it more specific to sport, some of the kind of variable text in it. So that's part of my work this year that we'll be doing. So that'll be available. But for now, the one on your website is extraordinary. I recommend it to almost everybody I speak to. So go find the Office of the BC Ombudsperson website.
I have a link later on if people want to scribble it down, but it's a quick Google away, Google search away. Yeah, so the complaint handling guide that's on there. Our website also has a number of quick tips, which are like shorter sort of one-page resources that you can access. And then if you're a real keener, you can also watch a webinar that our office produced about complaint handling, but a lot of that material is sort of the same kind of stuff we're covering today. Okay, so moving along. So let's talk about, you know, how do you effectively handle those point of service complaints? So first, it's important that complaints are acknowledged promptly. Each organization is going to have a little bit different service standards, but generally speaking, it's good practice to acknowledge a complaint as soon as possible after receiving it, ideally within a couple of business days. And the reason for this is because if you're promptly acknowledging a complaint, you're signaling a commitment to addressing those service problems to the person. So you're already taking that first step and providing some really good service right away by just saying, we hear you, we've got your complaint. It's also important to validate the person's concerns and communicate to them that their complaint is important. I'll be going into a little more detail on ways you can do this later in the presentation when I'm talking about some of the essential communication skills that are really handy to use in complaint handling. And finally, organizations and their staff should be encouraged to seek early resolution to complaints as much as possible. This involves identifying what the person's primary concern is and determining whether it can be addressed quickly and to their satisfaction. Early resolution is really a win-win for everybody. For complainants, they get their concerns addressed quickly and informally, and for the organization, because it helps to maintain those positive relationships, it's efficient operationally, and ultimately you're retaining control over the resolution of that complaint. So it's important for staff who are receiving these point of service complaints to conduct a really good initial assessment to determine the most appropriate action to take in response to these concerns that a person is bringing to you. So when you're doing this initial assessment, you're going to want to consider who in your organization is the most appropriate to handle the complaint. Can it be resolved by the person who is receiving it, or should it be escalated to a specific department or somebody more senior within the organization? And again, this is why it's important to have a really clear complaints process in place for your organization, because it just helps everybody know where to direct things as they come in. And it helps to keep things consistent as well. Another thing you want to consider is the seriousness of the concerns that are raised, including the impact on the individual. So does the complaint raise serious issues that require the attention of your organization at a higher level? Or is it a lower level complaint that perhaps could be more easily resolved without having to escalate it up through the organization? And finally, we want to think about the urgency that's required in responding to the concerns. This is going to look a little different depending on each organization, but some examples might include if you're getting a complaint related to something that is a significant risk to an individual's health or safety, or perhaps complaints that involve risk to vulnerable individuals. Having these criteria laid out in policy can help organizations respond effectively to those higher priority and urgent matters. And so you're kind of triaging the complaints that you're receiving appropriately. And it helps those frontline staff know how to conduct that initial assessment. And it's almost just like this nice algorithm that you can use. Everybody knows what the next steps are going to be. So the next thing we want to think about is managing expectations. I always, this picture, and the analogy actually doesn't really work that well, but it always makes me think of every morning when I just so ambitiously think that I'm going to be able to wrangle my 2 small children out the door in like timely fashion, and there'll be no tears. And then it just never goes that way. But we try. So when people's expectations exceed what an organization is able to deliver, this is going to create some issues. So in this scenario, either the service level is going to need to increase, or people's expectations are going to need to be better managed. And sometimes it's kind of a combination of both of those things. But what do we mean when we're actually talking about managing expectations? So when managing somebody's expectations, the first step is predictably to find out what their expectations are. And then as soon as possible, correct any of those expectations that are unreasonable or unrealistic. Sometimes an organization can meet somebody's expectations and sometimes they can't, but it's always important to know what they are. And as a result, it's essential that you discuss the expectations as soon as possible in the complaint handling process, because this is going to minimize the likelihood that the person will end up disappointed or angry or frustrated down the road. And all of those emotions are catalysts for unreasonable conduct. When people have realistic expectations about what they can expect from you or your organization, they're more likely to perceive the outcome of the process as fair. So, it's kind of one of those things that if somebody can understand the reasons for something, maybe they're still not going to agree, but they're more likely to accept. It's along the same lines as that. And so to that end, managing expectations is an essential part of handling point of service complaints, especially where the person's concerns can't immediately be resolved. So it can help to sort of explore that with them at the outset. You can just ask them simply, what is the outcome that you're looking for here? How would you, what do you think would resolve this, and have that conversation, because that's the best way that you're going to actually find out really what those expectations are. And then once you've got a sense of what that person is expecting, you can start to manage the expectations by doing a few things. So first, you can tell them what your role is in the complaint handling process, and how their complaint is going to be dealt with. And this might include, what immediate steps are going to be happening so that they know what to expect. Next, you want to be clear about what issues you're considering in your review of their complaint. So sometimes somebody might come to you with a litany of complaints, a whole bunch of different things. And after you've had a chance to review them, you may realize that it's just not, there's no benefit, or it wouldn't be appropriate, or for whatever reason, there may be some of their complaints that you're excluding. It's very important to be able to explain to that person why you've identified these things for investigation. That's my investigator talk, but for looking into for the complaint handling, and why these ones aren't. And so really thinking that through in your head would be my tip before you have the conversation, so that you've kind of got all those reasons, so you can explain it to them so that they'll understand. You can also explain the level of involvement that they can expect, and how they'll have a chance to be heard throughout the complaint handling process. If you have an idea or a sense of how long it generally takes to go through the process, it's kind of nice to give somebody a heads up. Even if it's a window, it's part of managing. Somebody thinks that you're going to get back to them by tomorrow and how the whole thing will be wrapped up, but actually you're going to need a month. Probably good to give them a heads up about that. And then it can also be really helpful to ask them how they'd like to see the issue resolved. And then by clarifying to them what possible outcomes may or may not be achieved through the complaint process. All right, so top 3 ways to resolve complaints. Of course, there are a lot of ways. We've got 3 here that I think are pretty impactful. But again, everything, it's going to depend on the nature and the scope of the complaint that you're dealing with. And with that said, the resolution should be fair and proportionate to the seriousness of the issue and the impact to the person or the group that's affected. And a little sort of thing to think about here is that what you perceive as serious, and what the complainant perceives as serious may be really different. And so going back to a few slides ago when I was talking about having a very clear complaint policy that's available on your website or in other publications, if you have that, that can help back up your assessment of complaints. That can really help bridge that gap between what you're assessing is serious and what the person is bringing to you and what they believe is serious. So without further ado, we see that there's 3 key ways to resolve complaints. And the first is to provide a better explanation of the original decision. So this is often about just sort of going back and giving better and more clear reasons for a decision that impacted somebody that now they're complaining about, in a way that they're going to be able to understand. And that's going to need to include how that decision was reached, what information was considered, and what rules applied in the situation. So again, this is very organization dependent, but was there specific legislation or policy or eligibility criteria that was applied? All of that information, sometimes just given in a more clear, more direct format, can help, can be very impactful to people. The second is to reconsider the original decision. And so this one kind of depends on if this is a mechanism that is available to you in your organization. But if folks have the right of an appeal, then they should be made aware of that. But something to keep in mind when reconsidering decisions is that the decision maker who's going to be doing the reconsideration needs to be impartial, and they need to have an open mind. So they can't let that existence of the complaint itself bias them in any way. And then thirdly, probably the most effective thing that we see here at the office is to simply provide an apology. So we recognize that there can definitely be a reluctance to apologize. However, apologies can be extremely helpful. They demonstrate empathy, which can de-escalate situations and repair the harm experienced by the person. And providing an apology also demonstrates integrity on the part of the organization. It shows that the organization is willing to be accountable to the people that it serves. You might be thinking that an apology is not really an impactful remedy. But really and truly here at our office, we see that it is. And often an apology is a recommendation that we will make to an organization at the outcome of our investigations, once we've determined that it appears that there was some unfairness. And really, when you think about it, even if you're the person that's complaining, a lot of times all we want is just for somebody to apologize, to sincerely apologize, right? It can really make a big difference. Okay, so let's switch into some communication tips that we can use for effective complaint handling. These are often best used at that first point of contact, and they can be helpful to de-escalate, any situations that are starting to escalate, and also to help facilitate a resolution. So it's important to remember that any communication in any context, including complaint resolution, is happening between usually two, sometimes more people, and that everybody is going to be bringing their own lens and perspectives to those interactions. But it's also not just about our own individual attributes. It's also about the systems and the institutions that are involved in these interactions and the power imbalance that can occur from that. I think it's also important to just remember that as people, we are going to be affected by things like, did you have a bad morning? Do you have some stuff going on in your personal life? Did you, or like me, did you discover that the bus route has been completely changed on your way to work and you had an unexpected sprint this morning? I'm joking around a little bit, but we just need to keep in mind that everybody's bringing their own stuff to the table, right? And so we need to be mindful of that. Okay, so we're going to get into these communication tips that can be effective for complaint handling. I've talked about how these things are really good for de-escalation, and there's so many more things, but I think we're just going to touch on the high points here in the time that we have today. So one of the first things we can do is use active listening throughout our interaction with somebody who brings a complaint forward. So active listening is hard work. If you've ever tried it, it really does take a lot of focus, and it means that you really need to have a genuine interest in understanding what the person is saying. You're withholding judgment. You are not thinking of your response. You're truly listening to understand. And so secondary to that, if you're employing active listening, you are trying to learn about and acknowledge that person's experience. And through that, you're going to have an opportunity to demonstrate some empathy. So empathy is essentially being able to identify a feeling in you, or a memory in you that can identify with what that person is going through. So you're feeling with the person. It doesn't mean that you're agreeing with them all the time, but it means that you can say, yeah, I know how that feels. It shows it. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but it really, it helps to show that person that you're a human. You're not, behind all the red tape, or I'm thinking about a big organization, maybe in a small one, it would feel a bit different, but that there's a human behind all that bureaucracy, and you're still just two people interacting. Okay, so focusing on the facts can help the person to clearly articulate the issue that they're bringing to you. So if you ask them to define the primary issue that they want addressed, and then to submit what they view as the most important information they want you to consider, this can be very helpful. When you're focusing on the facts, you're likely to find some opportunities for resolution. Using clear and simple language is also really important. This includes providing clear explanations to individuals that they can understand through things like accessible language. You should definitely avoid using jargon or more sophisticated language if you believe that that person isn't going to be able to understand what that means. The next tip is to provide a space for silence. So not just to give the person an opportunity to be heard, but also to slow down the conversation and to help de-escalate somebody who might be getting, a little bit wound up or a bit upset. And finally, we want to be trauma informed in our approach. So in the next few slides, I'm going to focus on the first and the last tips here. So we'll talk about active listening, and then we'll get into the trauma-informed approach a little bit. So active listening is probably the most important skill required in complaint resolution, because listening is a precursor to problem solving. So as I alluded to before, active listening is certainly different than just listening. It's hard work. You need to concentrate and focus. And it's almost a practice in mindfulness, except you're listening to what somebody else is saying. So active listening can help to build trust and rapport with the person, and it really helps them feel like their message has been heard. And it's only through hearing and understanding the other person's concerns that you're actually going to be able to have a basis to resolve them. So it's actually an extremely important part of complaint handling, because you need to be able to really get it in order to move forward and have the complaint have that circle be completely closed. Because if you miss stuff, then it's not finished, right? All right, so let's go through 3 practical techniques that you can use specific to active listening that might be helpful to you. So the first one is the use of open-ended questions. So the questions that you're going to ask when speaking with complainants, of course, are going to depend on what information you're looking for. But generally speaking, open-ended questions tend to get you more detailed responses. And again, these can help establish rapport because it shows that you're interested and you're curious in that person's experience. So here's a few examples of open-ended questions. I imagine that this is a review for a lot of folks today, but always good to go over it again. Asking these types of questions, okay, well then, and then what happened next? Those types of questions invite somebody to tell you what they think is important, and it can reveal important information that you might need to resolve the complaint. And it also helps you to determine if the resolution that they're looking for is something that is going to be possible. So the next active listening technique is paraphrasing. Paraphrasing, as I'm sure most of you know, is when you take what a person is telling you, you condense the content, and then you say it back to them, and then check for accuracy. So it gives you an opportunity to really confirm that you are understanding their complaint. So to paraphrase what the speaker is saying, you could say certain things like this, it sounds like you're concerned about X, Y, and Z. And paraphrasing is really tentative by design, because you are making sure that you're getting it right, and you're inviting the person to fix the little misunderstandings that may have occurred. Finally, reframing is another way that you can demonstrate active listening. Reframing involves retaining sort of that basic point of what somebody is saying, but maybe reframing it to use more neutral, non-judgmental, sometimes even positive language or terms. So oftentimes people who are complaining tend to use negative or loaded language, but by reframing the issue, it can be transformed from this unsolvable, awful problem into something that, hey, you know what, we can work on this and we're going to find a resolution here. So those are sort of the 3, I would say, key things to think about when you're using active listening. We do have a quick tip on our website called Effective Communication. Everything's on our website. I'm just going to keep mentioning that. So please go have a look later on. So let's move into being trauma informed. So we're just going to talk for a couple of slides about this, and I just want to give the disclaimer that this is a very broad topic, and by no means does this really begin to cover it, but it's just to sort of plant that seed. And I encourage everyone to, go and do a little bit more research if you haven't heard of trauma-informed practice, to learn more about it. So trauma is a term that's used to describe the challenging emotional consequences that living through a distressing event can have for someone. Traumatic events can be difficult to define because the same event that, ends up being traumatic for somebody may not be traumatic for someone else. Using a trauma-informed approach means that you're delivering services with an understanding of the impact of trauma, and you're really working to avoid re-traumatizing anybody in your interactions with them. So we're going to sort of run through this fairly quickly here, and there is going to be time for questions after. You know, maybe you've already received some trauma-informed practice training or guidance for your work, but it's important to remember the impact that exposure to trauma can have on people when you're responding to their complaints. The goal is not to become experts in trauma-informed practice, but rather it's for organizations to just be trauma-informed in the way that they deliver their services and respond to complaints from the public. So this means providing training in trauma-informed practice to staff who are responsible for handling complaints, with the goal being to create emotionally and physically safe systems and spaces that are going to minimize the chance of re-traumatizing individuals. So we know that trauma exposure actually impacts brain physiology. And individuals might exhibit some of the following behaviors and issues. And so when you take all of this into account and you think about somebody who is bringing a complaint forward, it can, you know, be a potentially unsuccessful situation if we're not coming at it with a trauma-informed lens. And so one way that we can approach sort of all of our situations is to use universal precautions, which really just means that we're assuming that the folks that we are working with to do the complaint resolution process have experienced trauma, and all that really comes down to is treating people with unconditional respect and understanding. And finally, I believe that we are nearing the end of the slides here, but I did want to put in a little bit about some techniques for dealing with maybe some more challenging behavior. And again, there's actually quite a lot more about this in our complaint handling guide. So if this is something that you're feeling like you encounter in your in the complaints that you're receiving at your organization, I certainly would send you over to the guide. But one of the things that staff might need to do is to use some assertive communication with somebody if they're starting to exhibit some challenging behavior. So, for example, this could be somebody who's over-speaking or continually interrupting you or being very disruptive or persistent, but you still have to treat them fairly and with respect. So how do you do that? The DESK model is an assertive communication model that's used in mediation, and it's very simple and very effective. So DESK stands for describe, express, specify, and then provide consequences. So when you're describing, you are describing the problem behavior, and you're doing that objectively and descriptively. You might specify the timing of number of times something has happened, and you want to focus on the actions or behaviors, so not your interpretation of those things. So an example might be, you know, Mr. Smith, I notice that your voice is getting very loud. And then we move on to the express. So we are expressing or explaining the impact that that behavior is having on you. And you're using, you know, I and not you statements, because those you statements can sometimes be a bit blaming and can just sort of add more fuel to the fire. So this is about explaining why the behavior is becoming an issue. So for example, you might say something like, I have difficulty hearing your concerns when you're talking to me so loudly. I use this with my 2-year-old all the time, but instead of loudly, I say whiny, and it actually works really well. So it has all sorts of applications. Now, sometimes you might get through those first two and you've drawn attention to it. The person realizes, you know, I'm sorry, I was getting a little hot-headed. I'm just really worked up, but you've drawn attention to it and you've managed to de-escalate it. If not, you can move on to S for specify, which is you could suggest how that behavior could change. You could make a request in terms of what you'd like that person to do. And it's important to be as specific and concrete as possible. So you might say, I would appreciate it if you could lower your voice. And then failing that working, you can move into consequences. And so consequences always sound like they're going to be negative, but it could be a positive consequence too, which is maybe more of an outcome. But if that person is able to lower their voice, then you can proceed with talking about their complaint or whatever it is that you're doing with them. If not, maybe we're going to need to find another time to discuss this once, you've had a chance to cool down. And I would just say that if you're going to be cutting off your communication with somebody, that it would be really important to set the next time or have a commitment from them that the next time we do this, like, let's try again. Can you agree to that? Can you agree to using a lower voice or whatever is appropriate for that situation? So that's pretty much it for me blabbing at you. I'm really curious to hear what kind of questions come up. This is just a little slide to show you some of the resources that we have available on our website. And the website is there, but you can easily just Google search us and then head over to our resources page. So thank you very much. And I guess, Andrea, maybe I'll stop sharing and okay.
Sounds great. Oh my goodness, that was fantastic. Oh, and I see there's already questions in the chat coming in. I just want to say, I'm always surprised when I get into this stuff, how much the focus is on communication and listening rather than on policy and procedure, which is what I think people always expect from these kinds of topics, that there's some magic procedure that we can use every time that is going to prevent bad things from happening. And really, it comes down to really good listening at the very beginning. And I'm really glad that that was emphasized and that you gave us some tips for that.
Great.
Before we start losing people who might have to hop into another meeting, I'd really love to run the second poll, and that'll give us a minute to read through the questions as well. Emily, if you're still there, can you come on screen and on mic and let me know if the poll is running, because I cannot see it.
Yeah, so we're doing the post-session poll.
Post-session, yes, please.
Yeah, okay, launching now.
And thank you to everybody for coming back on video. It's still lovely to see your faces. Yes, what constitutes a complaint? Yeah, and so this is a weird thing in the sports system right now, because you may know that there's a new national complaints mechanism, but at the moment it's only available to a very few national sports organizations. There's lots of movement in this at the moment, and hopefully in the future we'll have a good solution. But for now, everybody's still handling their own complaints. And even when we do have a solution for maltreatment complaints, you'll still get other kinds of complaints. You'll get selection complaints, or you'll get, whatever. There's always going to be something. And even if you can pass something on to a maltreatment hotline, somebody is going to disclose something to somebody in your organization at some point. So I think this information is relevant no matter what happens in the system.
Cool. So you have 85 people have responded, and it seems to be holding stable. So
okay,
I'll close
last
the poll.
chance. Close the poll. Perfect. Okay. Zoe, I know you were gonna help wrangle questions. If you and Erin are used to working together like that, then I can hand over to you, or however you'd like to do this.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. We'll do our best to answer our questions in the time that we have left. And these are really great questions, and I think they're definitely out of what we normally see. So this will be really interesting for us. So I guess we could just sort of start at the top. And Janet had a question in the chat here about dealing with complaints that weren't addressed in a timely manner. I mean, leaving aside the threat of litigation piece, I would say, if you would maybe want to get some legal advice about that. So we're not going to give any type of legal advice in this session. But I think for maybe when things become stale, and I think even just in answer to some of the other questions I've seen pop up already, it's that transparency about, what a person could expect. It's acknowledging if there was a mistake in your own complaints process handling, even acknowledging what the person is saying and acknowledging that, yes, this was not addressed in a timely manner and we're sorry. You can say that, and it gives a person, all those great communication things that Erin was saying, and why they're so important to having a solid complaints process, is that a person is feeling acknowledged. So, and then to say if the issue wasn't documented and there was no resolution at the time, I think, again, it's that this is an opportunity to identify maybe challenges with the process that you could then say at the time, this is what was the state of affairs. We hadn't documented it at the time. There was no resolution. This is now how we've changed as an organization, that we put these processes in place so that this doesn't happen again. So that would just sort of be my first off the top. But Erin, what do you think?
Yeah, I second that absolutely. And I think that it really does, like the first part of what you were saying, it really goes back to just, it's great to apologize and to validate that person's, that in and of itself is going to de-escalate that situation, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. And then you can go back in and say, okay, here are the things that, we're working on, or, hey, I just attended this workshop all about complaints handling, and here are some ideas that I have, honestly. Yeah, I think that's great. Mm-hmm. Everything that you said there, Zoe.
Can I pop in with something? Because it sort of ties in with some of the comments in the chat, that there's a difference between disclosure of an issue and a formal complaint. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're more likely to see in the sports system at the moment is people raising an issue, right? They're unhappy about something. And so these techniques are really useful in keeping that disclosure from escalating into a formal complaint, because we know how complex those can get. And yes, this recording will be made available at a later date. Back to you.
Yeah. So, and I guess sort of going next sort of down the line here, for Curtis was asking about, what constitutes a complaint, or, somebody has said there was inappropriate behavior, but they don't elaborate on it. And, to kind of what Andrew is saying about like policies and procedures, and I would say it's kind of both things. You need to have really these well-trained staff who can have these communication skills, but it's also really important to have some structure in place. And that could be in your policies and procedures. And if you can define behaviors, for example, or provide examples of, if a policy says, X isn't tolerated, or this is our expectation for X, Y, and Z, or when we say inappropriate behavior, this could mean here is a list of issues or a list of behaviors that might fall under that umbrella of inappropriateness, because sometimes it can be challenging, when you're responding to a complaint, if you don't have anything sort of defined, or it's all kind of wishy-washy. If a person just says, well, I have a concern, and you want to be able to flesh out, well, what does that actually look like? Or if they said there was some inappropriate behavior, you could say, well, here's our expectations. This is what the standards are, or this is what what we would define as inappropriate behavior. So to have something like that and have some clarity around that with a policy, a procedure, or some written framework.
Luckily that we have a BC Universal Code of Conduct that all accredited sports organizations have adopted. And so we do have common language. So we're in this position where we have quite strong policy with really clear definitions, and now people are getting complaints against it, and it's what do you do? What do you do when you get the phone call? Right? Okay. So yeah, that's exactly why we asked you to come and talk to us, which is fantastic. Yeah. We're getting really close on time. We've got 1 minute left. If you need to pop out of here, go ahead. I just wanted to say, if you would like continuing education credits through the NCCP locker, you can email Emily. And Emily, can you just drop your email address in the chat for me? And if you need to pop off, then you're welcome. Erin and Zoe, are you willing to stay on a little bit longer to work through a few more of these?
Yeah, fantastic. For sure.
Thank you so much. Okay.
So Erin, do you want to go to
sure, yeah.
for more here?
Let's see. Okay, so Curtis, you had another comment here. When addressing a complaint against a coach, how do you deal with the representation for the coach? Well, I feel like this is a little out of my wheelhouse. But I think, I don't know, Zoe, if you have any thoughts, I think that I would first just focus on getting as many details as I can about the complaint and the ways in which this person has perhaps tried to raise their concerns out, prior to coming to you. But then I think without really, I don't really understand the system necessarily and how that works in terms of having a representation for the coach and that kind of stuff. It might be difficult for me to answer that question in a really clear way. Zoe, unless maybe you've got some thoughts on that.
Yes.
We actually have a system in place with the Sport Law Connect program. If any of our accredited organizations are having issues that are becoming legal, there's a form on our website, or you can just reach out to me by email and we can talk about the potential for that. It's free access to either mediation or facilitation or a panel hearing. So if you're in that kind of a situation and you are one of our accredited organizations, or if you're a club of one of our accredited organizations, you can request through your PSO, DSO, or MSO, you can request access to that service. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. And the other piece we have that I should mention is Nadia, who is on here, who is our safeguarding liaison. And if you're in the beginning of a complaint that's brewing and escalating and you're a bit stuck, again, reach out to me and we can see if Nadia can come in and help mediate that situation.
Yeah. That's great. And I don't know if maybe either Andrea or Nadia could answer a question that Nick had put in the chat here about there being any work. Is there any work being done towards a comprehensive complaints discipline process that sports at all levels can then just tweak?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes, there you go.
Yes, I could show you my project plan. There are many things on it, but yeah, absolutely. Because why are so many organizations having to reinvent the wheel? You know, we've got 71 accredited organizations and all of their member clubs, and nobody has the capacity. You know, we talk about training staff to handle complaints. Some of these organizations are volunteer based completely, and they don't have the capacity. So yes, we're trying to help fill those gaps.
Great. And Erin, maybe you have some other insights on a question here from Kurt about how do you build a culture of acceptance of complaints? So how do you actually do that?
That is an excellent question. I think really, well, I would hope that maybe the sports community would be good at this about, like it's all about mindset. And I think that really it's about reframing and just looking for opportunities. So, if obviously it's not nice to get complaints about your organization, or maybe even about you, if you're the person that the complaint is about, of course it feels uncomfortable and it's not nice. But I think that trying to not panic initially and remain as sort of calm and level-headed as possible, in order to look through sort of the weeds of, maybe there's some grumpy things that the person is raising, and maybe there really is something that's really valid that is a great opportunity for your organization to improve upon. And I think that that's sort of the way that I would try and approach it, while acknowledging, yeah, it's not the best feeling. It is uncomfortable to have to receive those complaints about your organization. I see that Peter, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, if you don't mind me asking, I didn't really know how to type this into a question, but, a lot of what we do in community, doesn't happen in person. It happens via email. And, implementing policy such as mandatory vaccinations, we experience, coaches that are not willing to, I guess, provide proof of vaccination. And then, so it's kind of traumatizing for them. And it's very, I guess you could say, limited conversation and dialogue, because they basically shut down to an extent. And like I said, it's done through email. So it's a tough one to navigate, especially if, you know, it's still required from an organization or a community that, you know, coaches still provide proof of vaccination. So talking about policy, talking about trauma, but how do you deal with something like that when it's done through email?
Yeah. Yeah, and email definitely has some limitations for sure. If we're talking about there's a starting point of resolving complaints is having that communication and that connection, and that how do you demonstrate empathy through email? Like, I think that's a pretty challenging thing. And I think, you know, I can imagine it might be to say, like, this is why I want to talk to you about this. So like, I would like to set up a call because I really want to hear from you. I want to understand where you're coming from on this. And the best way for me to be able to do that is if we can just actually talk on the phone or do something like that. So if you can maybe like get in the buy-in from the person to understand why it's in their best interest to engage in that communication, that's going to be better than just like an email back and forth. I think that can maybe be a good way to open up the door. But Erin, what do you think about that?
Well, first, I think that's hard. That's a really tricky, and to be fair, I really hadn't considered that because I don't really know from all of your organizations how everybody's set up and how everybody's functioning. So Peter, that's a really tough one. I think that I would, you know, echo Zoe's suggestion there in just trying to find a way to get some buy-in, for lack of a better word, and be sort of as open and receptive as possible, to genuinely really try and understand, like, what is the barrier? How can we work collaboratively? And then what's sort of like a hard, you know, if you're required to have proof of vaccination, then how can we resolve this? But I don't have like I wish I had a magic wand answer for you, because that's a really tricky situation. And email, I think technology is wonderful in so many respects, but it really removes that human element. And even just providing, this is going on a tangent a little bit, but you know, moving from being a nursing instructor and teaching in class all the time to now doing this role that I'm in where everything's by Zoom, even just that is difficult because I'm not in the same room with all of you. And so let alone trying to resolve brewing disputes or some challenges that you're seeing over email, that's hard. But I think Zoe, I think those were some good suggestions, at least to start with.
And I think like, yeah, anything, even just with our, you know, what we see at our office with complaints that come to us, sometimes it's just like a lack of transparency. So there wasn't really clear information provided to a person about, you know, a process or about what they could expect or about how their complaint is going to be responded to. And I think in the absence of having like really clear, being really upfront, doing that expectation management, then I think sometimes things can really spin out of control, or then people can then get stuck in a mindset that can be, you know, more challenging to bring them out of. So I think that just transparency can really go a long way to heading off the path some of those other issues.
Yeah.
Nadia, I think you had some suggestions.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in while people are still on the call and introduce myself to the bigger group. I'm the safeguarding liaison with VIA Sport, and one of my roles is to support complaint resolution through communication and conflict management training. So I know that, and Zoe and Erin, what a great presentation. I was sitting back here the whole time going, yes, 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 this is all. So I would love to work with organizations to support that. And I can also act as a neutral facilitator if there is a situation that's caught and you feel that a neutral facilitator could support resolution prior to it going into a formal complaint. Andrea, I know, has sent out a call for applications because we don't necessarily have the funding to offer conflict management training to every organization. Andrea, when's the deadline for that?
Well, it was tomorrow, but we've extended it by a week. So next Friday is a pretty short application process, and I'll let Nadia explain a little bit more. But Peter, before you head off, if you think Nadia might be able to help you with your situation, you can reach out to me by email and we can try and line something up.
Perfect, thank you.
And Nadia, maybe you could also answer this question or have some thoughts on it from Curtis about the use of elders in resolving complaints.
Yeah, I think that's one of my background is in social work. And that's one of the things that we definitely lean heavily on is guidance from elders and looking at traditional ways of managing complaints. There's a lot of communities have elder circles who are there to run traditional complaint managing mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I was really pleased to see that in the chat as well.
I think we may have an endless stream of questions on this topic, to be honest. So what I am going to do is put my email. Well, I tell you what, I'll put the generic one in here. .ca. If you have further questions, we'll go through the chat. We're going to save the chat and we'll go through it. And if you have other questions that pop into your head, email them to me and I will compile them into one email that I will send to Erin and Zoe sometime next week, rather than peppering you with a bunch of things. And when we send our share back email with the recording, and I don't know, Erin, if you're willing to share the slide deck.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. So we'll try and get you as much of this information into your inbox as we can. And I'm sorry, I'm completely lost my train of thought. I got back from Paris on Monday, folks. I don't know what day or time it is. Anyway, we'll send out the information. Oh, and the answers, any answers from the questions that you want to send in. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this. And Erin and Zoe, that was fabulous and fantastic. And yeah, just thank you so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope it was helpful. I hope that there'll be some takeaways for everybody.
Already there are, yes. So thank you. Take care, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.